Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we're at part 4 of our Tamiya TT-02D Drift Spec Toyota Supra build series. We're going to be working on steps 11 and 12, which is to attach the motor onto the motor mount and then install it into the chassis frame. Before we start, let's learn a few important terms for this step. So this is the motor, obviously. It's made out of coiled wires and magnets inside. That by itself is a totally different video. I found a great one that explains how a motor works. If you're interested, I'll put a link in the description below. So the motor is like the engine of a car. The ESC, or electronic speed control, sends the motor commands to go forward, brake, or reverse. All you need to know for now is that the motor can spin clockwise, counterclockwise, and the rotations can be controlled to go slow, fast, or even idle. That's the body of the motor, and that's the shaft, and that's the part that spins. Notice the pinion gear, there's a screw hole right here. And if you take a look at the motor, the shaft has a flat part right there. Hope you can see that. And the pinion gear secures onto the motor shaft through this hole with this grub screw, which is in the same bag. This TT-02 kit comes with a 22 tooth pinion gear. That's the number of teeth that goes around the entire gear. There are option parts that have fewer or more teeth. And the number of teeth on the pinion gear and spur gear affects the acceleration and top speed of the car. But that's also another video all by itself. For now, we only have to work with what's in the box. So when the motor spins the pinion gear is going to spin the spur gear. Spur gear and the shaft is going to spin the differentials on both sides, and the differential is going to drive the wheels. We'll talk about the relationship between all of the electronics and the car's systems in an upcoming video. All right, let's get started with step 11. First, let's take a look at the motor mount. There are numbers stamped next to all these holes. Starts at 21, 22, 23, 24, etc. And on the opposite side, it starts at 16 and it goes to 20. And again, we have a 22 tooth pinion gear. And Tamiya made it really easy. The holes on the motor mount is going to correspond with the number of teeth on the pinion gear. So we're going to be working with hole 22 right here and then directly across, which is this one. And so we're going to be screwed it onto the corresponding holes on the motor, which is going to be this one and this one. And to fasten the motor, we're going to be using this AMain 4 screw. If you take a close look, you can see the teeth are a lot closer together. This is the AMain 2 screw we've been using a lot. The grooves are a lot further apart and it's slightly tapered top to bottom. And for whatever reason you want to use a smaller motor, there's a 380 size motor mount right there. All right, to get started, first by putting this motor plate onto the two holes. I'm going to line that up. And I'm going to assume this motor plate is a heat shield between the motor and the plastic motor mount. So I have to make sure the holes line up, press it all the way down. And I'd like to have the labeled right side up when it's in the chassis. So I'm going to be using this hole on top. And on the motor mount, this would be the top, and this part goes into the chassis. So I'm going to make sure hole 22 lines up with that top hole right there. Like that. And then start driving the screws in. Just like that. You notice there's a little box here. When using different pinion gears, go to page 19, just like we had up here with the short wheelbase. So let's take a look what's on page 19 for the pinion gear. So on page 19, it talks about the different gear ratios you can achieve when you're using a pinion gear either with fewer teeth or more teeth. And how when you're using a 16 tooth pinion gear, for example, you're going to turn the motor mount over and use these two holes to mount the motor. The gear ratio is related to the acceleration and top speed of the car. Again, that's a different video. All right, let's move on to step 12. All right, on to step 12. For this step, we're going to need the chassis, the motor, the pinion gear, and the grub screw. 8 of these MA2 screws. The spur gear cover, which was on the D tree. 2 battery posts. 1 of each was on the B tree. The heat sink. Some grease. And a 1.5mm hex screwdriver. If you don't have one, there was a hex wrench included in the kit. All right, before we attach the motor onto the chassis, we need to put on the pinion gear first. All right, so first we're going to thread the grub screw onto the pinion gear. Then we're going to find the flat spot on the motor shaft, and I'm just going to turn it all the way up to the top. And we just need to make sure the grub screw matches up with that flat part. And we're going to just loosely screw that in. And if you see here, it needs to be 10mm from the top of the pinion gear to the face of the motor mount. That's going to be pretty close. I'm going to see what it looks like when we mount it onto the chassis and how it lines up with the spur gear. And that's what you would do if you don't have a caliper. And before we put this into the chassis, we're just going to need to bend these terminals in a little bit, get the wires out of the way. Let's bring back the chassis frame. You can see there's a little cradle right here. That's supposed to line up with this part of the motor mount. Just going to drop that in. And I'm just going to check the alignment between the pinion gear and the spur gear. And they're lining up pretty close. The pinion gear isn't higher than the spur gear, or is it below the spur gear? So if you were doing this without the caliper, that's how you would eyeball it. You just mount the motor and take a look at the alignment. And now I'm just going to tighten that grub screw. Now we're going to turn the chassis over and put the screws in here and here. And while we're working on the bottom, let's go ahead and place these battery posts. We could have slipped the heatsink onto the motor before we set it down, but it's not that much harder to get it in here. And then make sure to turn it over so that it doesn't interfere with the drive shaft. And lastly, we're going to put on the spur gear cover. Just going to set that down. The plastic on the spur gear cover is pretty brittle, so try not to over tighten these screws. All right, and we're done. So today we attached the motor to the motor mount. We put on the pinion gear, set the motor into the chassis, close it up, put on the heat sink, and also put on the 2 battery posts. So thanks for watching this video. If you got anything out of it, please drop a like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one.